Surgeons who work with amputating limbs, what was your worst OF moment? Surgeon here. Have a few stories. 1. Call to the ED to evaluate a table saw injury to arm. Found a mid-forearm almost complete amputation hanging on by a skin bridge. We were able to reattach it, and I think the patient has good muscle function, but tenuous sensation back now. 2. My intern year. Got a consult for a cyclist who was blindsided by a pickup truck. Entire leg was completely mangled. He arrived intubated and sedated with lots of other injuries. Dude never woke up. It was the first time I saw a leg filleted open from trauma, with exposed femur, also fractured, and multi-level open tib fib fracture, just hanging out of the tissue in the addition. We amputated the leg at the shin, and then femur, while trying to save him. He died of massive kidney failure from muscle injury. Dead muscle protein clogs the kidneys like taking a big dump clogs your toilet. Kidneys failed causing liver to fail, and then lungs fill with fluid means they can't ventilate, and cardiac issues follow from electrolyte abnormalities. No amount of existing technology can bring you back from that, unfortunately. 3. One of my worst cases was a patient with really bad sepsis from an infection. All the blood vessels in your extremities constrict, so amputating fingers isn't all that common. But this was catastrophic, as we ultimately had to amputate all 4 limbs. I'll never forget writing that op report. You list each procedure for these documents, and it went. 1. Amputation left arm. 2. Amputation right arm. 3. Amputation left leg. 4. Amputation right leg. Patient was a Family Guy fan, and said their Halloween costume would be the pirate the following year. At least they didn't lose their sense of humor, cause that was ultimately some funny shit. When the blood was gray, rare disease caused by overdose of migraine medicine. Surgery resident here. The oh duck moment doesn't really happen in the or, but can happen after. One consideration is always at what level do you need to amputate? The toe, a transmitter tarsal, BKA or ACA, below or above knee amputation. If you decide too much, some sicker or more elderly patients may never regain mobility again. If you choose too little, the disease process, infection, or ischemia might not be controlled, or won't heal, and you end up going back for more. The realization you have to go back for more is the moment. This isn't 100% on point, but I think close enough, and I think interesting. I'm now a head and neck surgeon, but during my trauma rotation as an intern we had an extremely inebriated guy come in who'd been hit by a car just outside of the party he'd been at, and suffered a traumatic amputation. The accident knocked his leg off at the knee, so he's wheeled into the trauma gurney on a bed, and his leg is brought into the same room literally in a bucket of ice. The guy was super combative, trying to push us around, and at one point literally yelled "duck off, let me walk it off." By my calculations he would made it 1 step, 2 tops. I remove a lot of eyes. When training, I had a nasty one that I just couldn't grip with forceps while I was making the main cut in the optic nerve. I had to resort to gripping it with my fingers. As you are imagining, I made the cut. It shot through my fingers like a grape, hit me in the chest, rolled down my gown, bounced off my foot, and rolled about 10 feet on the floor, leaving a bloody snail trail. It was a lunch break change, so about 10 people were in the room switching over. I headed upstairs. When I was done to join my preceptor in another case, he sees me walking, sees a bloody spot on my shoe cover and asks, "You didn't drop the eye, did you?" My head just sank. Agreed with the surgeon above that our training is so long detailed that we don't have these moments frequently. However, in residency I was doing a hemipelvectomy, essentially a removal of half of a patient's pelvis with or without removal of that leg, with my attending surgeon, and we came to a crucial step. After a few hours of dissection and planning, we had made our cuts on the pelvis, basically planning and mapping out the portion we would remove. The time came for us to complete the cuts by levering out the half of the pelvis with our hands, which required a lot of force. After the levering, there was an audible crack, expected, but then the wound immediately filled with blood, unexpected. My training to that point told me to immediately pack the wound and hold pressure. My attending looked at me and said keep holding pressure, and then scrubbed out, took off his gown and gloves, and left the room. I'm now standing there over this young patient holding pressure with all my might so that my arms are shaking. I looked to anesthesia and his PA and asked what the hell was going on. Here I'm single-handedly keeping this patient alive with no direction or immediate game plan about how to fix our problem. This was my oh duck moment. An eternity, it seemed, went by and my attending came back in, scrubbed in, and we then methodically isolated the large bleeding vessels and tied them off, cauterized them. Afterwards I asked him what he was doing. He said over the years he had learned, if he had a rise in anxiety from something unexpected, I guess his oh duck moments, he would take a breather, whether physically removing himself from the situation or not, to refocus and psyche himself up to fix the issue. This was one of my greatest learning moments of my career. Not a surgeon, but I work in a facility that helps with rehabilitation of amputees and getting them walking again. I watch a resident go to stop a door from closing with his stump, and it was like the world slowed down. From the moment I saw him move his stump to stop it, to the point of impact I was screaming, oh duck, that's gonna hurt so bad. And it did. He looked at me and just cried. I pushed him back to his room in his wheelchair, and he apologized profusely, saying that it's just instinct cause he had a leg there for so long. He ended up splitting the stitches back open, and the infection that came after ended with him going from a mid-shin amputation to above the knee the next week. He was a great guy. He's walking and back to living his regular life again. Not a surgeon, but a leg amputee. I was reading the notes from my surgery and the doctor stripped the screws when trying to remove the titanium plate that was holding my leg together. He had to call in backup. I work in the quality department for a large hospital system. We had a doc take off the right foot instead of the left. That was a lot of fun paperwork, as well as a lawsuit. Wrong side surgeries are surprisingly more common than you'd think. Wrong side amputation, however, is thankfully more rare. I was first assisting on a emergent guillotine ankle disarticulation. You basically just rip and cut the foot off from the leg and leave the bones sticking out. I was providing traction on the intensely infected foot, while the surgeon sliced through the remaining tendons holding it in place. When the last one snapped, I fell back, holding onto the now independent foot, squeezing a load of green pus out onto my chest. Was just thankful it hit the gown and not my exposed neck. I'm not a surgeon, but I did rotated surgery back in my med school days. My first day on surgery rotation, I was assigned to the trauma team. This was at a level 1 trauma center in an inner city hospital in New York. It just happened that on my first day, all the residents were in a meeting, so when the trauma surgeon needed an assistant, she asked me to join her for an emergency above knee amputation of about infected leg, wet gangrene in a very poorly controlled diabetic. So my first day on surgery, I'm in the, or holding this man's infected leg while the surgeon saws it off. After she's done, she literally squeezes out pus from the thigh. The odor was putrid. It's one of those smells that lingers for days. For the surgeon it was just another day, but for me, it was definitely an oh duck moment. Edit, removed extra res from pus. Resident surgeon, assisting on a below the knee amputation due to necrosis from diabetes. Leg was incredibly crusty with dead skin. Removed the leg, handed it off to a tech to put into a box for disposal. Idaho Spuds cardboard box lined in plastic. Tech trips on his booty, almost fell, but squeezed the leg so hard the inside popped out from the skin sock. It flew across the floor, leaving a slug-like trail of pullulant slime as it skidded. We retched. We laughed. We moved on. The first surgery I saw as a nursing student was a toe removal. Poor patient had to have his big toe removed due to a diabetic ulcer that had gotten infected. I was so afraid of the thought of getting nauseous with my first surgery. I didn't eat breakfast that day. The case started at noon. I was wrapped in the sterile gown and mask cover show covers. I was positioned by the circulating nurse in a spot with a great view, but wouldn't get in the way. The case started, and the doc started cauterizing bleeding veins capillaries right off the bat. I learned that cauterizing flesh smells a lot like searing steak. My empty stomach and hungry brain didn't know the difference, and I could hear my stomach growling at the smell. I thought it would be just my embarrassment, until the surgeon and nurse both looked at me. They could hear it too. I'm not sure what I said, but I was glad my mask hid how I was struggling not to cry. It was awkward until the doc took the severed toe and tossed it over the patient and into the formalin container. He had great aim. As a med student, I used a jiggly saw to remove a dead leg from just above the knee from a man who was homeless and horribly diabetic. When it came off, the surgeon said, "Here," and handed it to me. Then he said, "Take a picture, it's your first one." Like someone was gonna have me hold it like a fish I caught. He was joking, but I was freaked out and dropped it on the floor. Such a weird moment in my training. Or nurse here recently did a below the knee amputation. The leg was severed and I was passing it off to the circulating nurse for specimen. Went to take a clamp off a large artery and my poor co-worker got a big spray of blood. Felt terrible. Had a trauma case one time where the paramedics said a dog amputated a patient's foot. We were expecting them to be blowing it out of proportion and got ready for just a severe bite. Nope, we were wrong. Patient rolls in and the foot is almost completely off, except a piece of skin holding it together. Turns out the dog must have been super pissed because it chomped right through. We had a trauma come in from a concrete factory. I'm not sure about the exact details, but a guy fell into some machine and his left leg got pretty messed up. We went to the OR to wash it out and evaluate if he needed an amputation or not. Once we got it all cleaned up, we saw it was pretty mangled and there was concrete encasing part of his leg. So we start to do an above the knee amputate because there's concrete in his knee and distal femur. As we're pushing the oscillating saw through the femur, it hits more resistance usual and starts to make unusual sounds. We had missed some concrete on the back of the guy's thigh and tried to saw through it. Almost everyone in the room, the nurses, anesthesia, the students, etc., said "oh duck" at the same time. We ended up having to go even higher up on femur. I'm not sure whatever ended up happening later on prosthesis wise because we transferred the patient to the ortho service. Not a surgeon, but used to work in a nursing home, and I was meeting a patient for the first time without reading their file. As I entered the room I said, "Wacky wacky, let's jump out of bed," and as I looked at him, I said, "Let's kick those covers off." Once I removed the blanket and saw he had no legs, things got quiet quick. When I was a child, my dad's favorite joke, whenever I hurt myself and cried, was to grab a meat cleaver from the kitchen, hide it behind his back, examine my injury closely, prodding the sore spots with his finger, and after 45 seconds of examination of the bruising say, "I'm sorry son, we are going to have to amputate your insert leg foot limb. Hun, come hold him down while I chop please," and he'd whip out the cleaver and carefully line it up, while 6-year-old me would scream and try and squirm free and run away. He'd then usually say, when I hobbled away, "Oh, so it must not be that bad after all. Hun, cancel that procedure." Turns out he can actually walk. One time he did this, and I caught him in the stomach with a little kick, and he let out a little "oh duck" and almost dropped the cleaver. So this reminded me of that. Thanks. Not a surgeon, but had a patient who was homeless and did not seek medical treatment for an ingrown hair that had become infected. By the time the man was brought into the ED, he had developed Fournier's gangrene, Google at your own risk, that required amputation of his testicles and debridement of his perineal area. The smell was so rotten as the infection had gone on for so long that even most of the seasoned OR staff had to leave the room to vomit. At one point, only the surgeon and anesthesiologist were in the room. They ended up removing everything from his shaft to his anus. Helped at a leprosy hospital in the mid-90s in Calcutta. 2 memories. 1. A big bottle of surgical spirits fell off a table and exploded into fire during an amputation! 2. The doctor spilt some of the general anesthetic when injecting a patient. He continued with the amputation anyway. The patient started to come round early, so 4 of us had to prevent the patient from flailing around while the doctor finished sawing and then stitching. I'm sure this'll get buried, but what the hell. Finally something I actually have some first-hand experience in. I'm a general surgery resident. A few years ago, when I was pretty junior, I was doing an ACA, above the knee amputation, with a supervising surgeon who was a little less careful, let's say, than some others. I had just finished with the bone saw, and without thinking he hands me the guillotine knife, super sharp kitchen knife looking thing, and tells me to take the rest of the soft tissue away. In retrospect I would have done this differently, but didn't know better at the time. But as I cut with the knife I came through the largest artery in the thigh, and it started spraying blood across the table. This was my oh duck moment. I took a clamp, and without thinking just grabbed the thing, and luckily the bleeding stopped right away. Didn't affect the patient, but definitely left an impression on me. The attending surgeon didn't seem too concerned, but that's definitely not the right way to control a large blood vessel like that.